much of this week's economic focus will be on the South African Reserve Bank's Monetary Policy Committee meeting today, Thursday, 22nd. Now, analysts have been noting that the review will be a strong economic indicator given the recent strife seen domestically. The upcoming MPC preview will be one of the immense importance, as some adverse domestic readings and volatile expectations about global inflation and monetary policy dynamics will shift outcomes. So, joining us to discuss more on this, Mosope Arubayi, economist with IC Asset Managers. Mosope, very welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Let's start with inflation. We had the chart up there. What are the metrics, the drivers behind the deceleration in South Africa's headline inflation?
Okay. Unlike many other countries that we saw, South African inflation came down, and this was because sometime in May, the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy reduced the pump price of petrol, I think 10 cents per liter, and that filtered into lower transport inflation. I think transport inflation was down like 300 basis points, and that filtered into other subcomponents of the inflation index, the core, maybe clothing and the likes, and then also some components of the food inflation index saw their inflation moderate in June compared to May. All of this happened and contributed to the deceleration that we saw in the headline inflation.
So much news coming out of South Africa. The riots, we've got a damage estimate there. How do you think all this, if impacts the economy going forward in South Africa?
Yeah, it's quite disheartening. That week was was an interesting week, because the week before that I was just commending the markets for the strong performance they've put out this year. But a week after the riots happened, and then you had investors selling, reducing their exposure to their euro bonds and their bonds, and we saw the impact of that on the rand in the forex market, because the rand has actually been under a lot of pressure since the riots broke out. In terms of the economy, it's likely to slow the pace of the recovery, especially in Q3. We've seen that over like 3-4 quarters, contractions in South Africa have been like moderating. Yes. So they've been recovering gradually, and then you now have these riots that has probably disrupted production lines, many of which cannot be replaced so quickly. It will take some time to replace. So you're likely to see a setback in their recovery by about a quarter or two. So it doesn't look like South Africa will be out of a recession this year. Yeah. In terms of the inflationary impacts, we know that distribution lines supply chain lines were disrupted, and also we're likely to see that pressure on the cost of goods as well, in addition to the upward, because there was an upward review in pump price of petrol for July, so we'd see that, and we should also expect more upward reviews, given the fact that all this uncertainty, the result of all this uncertainty would probably result into weakening of the rand in the course of the year, and that would affect the pricing of the petrol going forward. So weaker, much longer recovery than expected, higher inflation in South Africa, not just South Africa, even for neighboring countries like Namibia that rely on South Africa for their food imports. You'll see that trend also filter into their inflation numbers as well.
Fantastic. So in August, looking at July,
we're likely to see it upward, much stronger than maybe May.
Okay, so does all this coming to the Reserve Bank and their MPC meeting today, how does all that come together with what possible outcome we might have at the MPC meeting?
I expect that they're going to hold at the end of the meeting. We can clearly see that the economy is still going to need some form of support to come out of a recession, especially with the setback from the riots. So a hike in rates is probably not likely. They're also not pressured in terms of the external sector. They've had many months of trade surpluses, so they're not under any pressure to try to tighten currently, just so that they're safe on the external sector side. Even though like there's still upside risk to inflation in the near term, I don't see them breaching the 6%, which is the upper band of the Reserve Bank's inflation target. So with the monetary aspect checked, the external sector checked, and then the need to provide further support to the economy for it to recover, I think a whole decision would be the most prudent that the bank would give.
I find it really fascinating with this. We've talked about them. The length of time this country has been in recession, the riots that are going on, the COVID pandemic, the lockdowns, the restriction on alcohol sales. In any other economy, it would be an economic catastrophe. But is it the level of industrialization of the South African economy that they can withstand all these shocks and still the central bank is, as you say, other analysts agree with you. They say they're going to hold.
Yeah.
How is it buffers?
I must say that the South African Reserve Bank is one of the most credible reserve banks in Africa. So that already puts them in a position to attract investment into the economy, regardless of whatever slippages that occur. So if we had to take out many of these slippages that you just mentioned, you would imagine where the South African economy would be, given the position of the Reserve Bank. So the recession that we have seen has been due to previous recessions that we've seen has been due to many of the economic problems, fiscal related and all that they have. But the Reserve Bank has been up and doing, its inflation is properly anchored. So even though we have this shock that could push it up, it's most likely not going to shoot beyond its target. That's like a decent indicator of a reserve bank that actually knows what they're doing, knows what is going on, knows how to put things in place in the event that things go the other way. Unlike some other countries on the continent where without any shocks, there's that disconnect between your monetary policy and then whatever your inflation or monetary targets are. So I think the Reserve Bank has actually been doing a good job. There are a number of other pluses in other areas. They have a floating currency, which is something that investors also like. So even though they have some shortcomings in some areas, they make up for that in some other areas, which is of interest to investors. Hence, they're able to attract the investment.
And in fact, speaking of the appreciation of the currency, I think you already mentioned it. That was part of the reason why we saw the deceleration in June. So it's, I'm kind of jealous. The rand appreciated, currency got stronger, and so the average South African was able to withstand.
Yes.
Yeah. Wow. That would be nice elsewhere, would it not? Would it not? Okay, we only got a couple minutes to go here. The economy is fine, but the riots, when you look at what led to them, despite the fact that we've talked up the economy as being strong and industrious, unemployment is what, 30% plus in South Africa. So they're as much as it's industrious, as much as it's strong. With what you've seen with these riots, it looks like they're still, the country seems to be on an edge where any little thing can set it off. Does that,
most African countries are in that situation, right? Because we've had many years of disconnect between the ruling class and the people that are being ruled. So basically, we need to come back to the table to understand that you cannot have a strong economy without having strong people.
Right.
A situation where you're growing the economy without growing. See Nigeria, for instance, consumption spending has been on a decline for a number of years. Even though after the last recession, we saw the economy recover, we saw growth increase for some years before 2020, but consumption spending has been on the decline. We have pressure from inflation and all other things. So you can't take out the welfare or the social aspect from the wider economy.
Great stuff. Mosope Arubayi, IC Asset Managers Economist. Thanks for taking us through South Africa's economy.
You.
Appreciate it.